Some medical practitioners abuse their power and use the system to fulfill their own sick desires. Today, we have Genene Jones and how children around her kept mysteriously dropping dead, and then Efren Saldivar, who lost count of the people that he killed throughout his professional career. In this video, we're looking at twisted nurses who went on deadly murder sprees.
You wish to plead guilty this morning.
Yes, Your Honor.
And are you pleading guilty because you aren't?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Mask, would you be kind enough to elicit a factual basis for it?
Yes, Your Honor.
Did you inject Ms. Stoker with any medication?
Yes.
And was it your intent to cause her to expire?
Yes.
And what agent did you use to accomplish that intent?
Digoxin.
Yes.
A nurse from New Jersey is known to have murdered around 45 of his patients during the 16 years that he worked as a nurse at 10 hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Charles Cullen is one of the most brutal serial killers America has ever seen. Born in West Orange, Charles grew up in an extremely troubled home. He tried to commit suicide when he was just 9 years old because he couldn't find any other way to escape his father's torture. As a young boy, Charles grabbed a bunch of chemicals from a chemistry set and drank them all in hopes of passing away peacefully. However, his parents caught him in the act and took him to the hospital where his life was saved. He was 17 when he enlisted in the Navy in 1978, and he was assigned to the submarine corps. However, when he was in the Navy, Charles showed signs of mental instability and would often steal drugs and other medical equipment from the ship's medical cabinets. He was transferred several times owed to his behavioral issues and his multiple attempts during his service. Ultimately, after resigning from the Navy right after the attempt, Charles decided to join a nursing school. After graduating, he worked as a nurse in several hospitals, and that's where his violent tendencies started taking over him. On numerous occasions, Charles was known to have stolen drugs from the several hospitals he worked at to overdose and commit. Once he even took a pair of surgical scissors and jammed them inside of his head. But of course, because he was surrounded by tons of doctors and other nurses, his life was saved. With a mental condition that is this unstable, it's unknown why Charles was still allowed to practice being a nurse and be around vulnerable patients all the time. But all of this was obviously only going down one dreaded direction. So ultimately, Charles ended up taking out his anger on the patients under his care. He would mess around with their drug dosages and give them lethal injections to end their lives. The kind of power rush that Charles experienced from all of this is what pursued him to keep killing one patient after the other. And he would do it so much with so much finesse that his crimes went unnoticed for the longest time. To the rest of the world, he was an honest nurse doing his job. Some of his colleagues were a little suspicious about his behavior, but no action was ever taken against him. During the time he was working as a nurse, Charles also married Adrienne Taub, and the couple went on to have 2 daughters together. However, Adrienne would later end up filing for divorce, accusing Charles of extreme domestic violence. She also went on to talk about how Charles was an alcoholic who their pets and emotionally tortured his wife and daughters. I mean, are we really surprised?
I still can't really comprehend it. A registered nurse who was supposed to be a caretaker took the life of my brother for his own personal, selfish, and twisted gain. Charles Cullen, you are a coward. I am very brave for standing here today, but you yet cannot even look me in the eye.
Do you remember the person?
I remember one, and that's the only person I've been able to identify. I wouldn't go in under ditch. I would go under Tylenol or another medication that would be in the same drawer. So, there was no record of me going in for a ditch other than the fact that, it was in the same drawer.
How did you choose who you were going to give this medication to?
It's difficult for me to go back in time and think about what things were running through my mind at the time.
Was it personal?
No.
Did you get pleasure out of it? Satisfaction?
No, I mean, I thought that that people weren't suffering anymore. So in a sense, I thought I was helping.
Starting off from the beginning, Charles's first ever murder took place in June 1988, when Judge John W. Yango Sr. was admitted to the St. Barnabas Medical Center after he had an allergic reaction to a blood-thinning drug. This patient was put under the care of Charles, and as soon as the twisted killer got his chance, he gave Judge John a massive overdose through his veins, killing the man then and there without any evidence. So people chalked it off to a natural death. Later on, Charles would also admit to murdering around 11 patients at St. Barnabas, with the most brutal murder being that of an AIDS patient who was given an overdose of insulin by the nurse. In 1992, the hospital authorities launched an investigation into all of these mysterious deaths, and that's when Cullen quit his job and moved on to Warren Hospital.
Well into the hundreds of how many people he not only tried to kill, but probably did murder, around 400.
So how did this monster evade justice for so long? Amy Loughran says Cullen moved from hospital to hospital, maintaining his cover as a caring nurse. She says hospital administrators suspected he was doing terrible things, but they turned a blind eye.
My hospital was responsible for allowing Charles Cullen to work after they knew unequivocally that he was murdering people.
At the Warren, Charles targeted 3 elderly women, killing them all in the same way, through overdoses of their medication. His final victim had even tried to warn the doctors about Charles injecting her with something strange while he thought that she was sleeping. But sadly, no one paid attention to her concerns until it was too late. Attempting to be a better man, he did not murder anyone in the first 2 years, or that's what he claims. Since the hospital records for this exact time period have been destroyed, it's essentially impossible for anyone to know what the criminal did and what he didn't. But come to 1996, and Cullen murdered 5 patients through overdoses of Digoxin. And this time around, he had become an actual licensed nurse, so no one ever questioned his actions. He then made his way to Morris Memorial Hospital, but he was fired from there for his poor performance. For a long time after that, Charles remained unemployed, and in October of the same year, he tried to seek help for depression. And while he was admitted to a facility, he ended up leaving when the treatment didn't work for him. The next year, he resumed his work as a nurse at the Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center. Here, there were multiple reports against Cullen giving patients at unscheduled times.
Was a very powerful cardiac medication.
What does it do to someone?
In small amounts, it slows the heart rate down. In larger amounts, it can cause what's called complete heart block. And then the heart is very irregular. And, it can cause death. It does cause death in large amounts.
When things started heating up, Cullen did what he did best. He made the switch to Elston Hospital in Pennsylvania, where he murdered yet another patient through an overdose. And while an investigation showed that the patient's blood contained lethal amounts of digoxin, no one could prove that Cullen was the culprit.
He murdered people right in front of me. The medications he used were brutal medications. Medications, for instance, that are paralytics, that you cannot speak, you cannot breathe, you cannot fight back, you cannot blink. You can hear everything that's happening.
Not just 1, but 7 St. Luke nurses then alerted the hospital authorities about Charles's suspicious behavior and his unusual habit of stealing drugs. The nurses reported that for the past year, Charles had only worked for about 20% of his assigned hours, but somehow he was always on duty when a patient had died. Sadly, because of a lack of evidence, the case had to be dropped. But let's just say that the authorities were watching Charles very carefully now, and his reign of terror would not be able to go on for much longer. Charles went on to work for some other hospitals, and eventually he was found to have been accessing records of patients that were never assigned to him. The Somerset Medical Center then launched an investigation that indicated the possibility that at least 4 of their patients had died because of an employee's malicious actions. And because the hospital took some time to investigate, that gave Cullen the opportunity to kill yet another 5 patients. This time even assaulting their dead bodies for his sick pleasure.
One day, without you even knowing it, your life will end. And what legacy will you have left behind, sir? A serial murderer, serial killer. You ruin the lives of your family, your children, and many people in this courtroom. You've bloodied and stained the medical profession. Absolutely abhorrent what you did, sir.
Ultimately, when a patient under his care died of low blood sugar and a fatal dose of insulin overdose, Somerset Medical Center launched an investigation into Cullen's past and revealed all of the past suspicions and involvement with patient deaths that he had concealed on his job applications.
All he cares about himself and his own children. He doesn't care what he did to our children.
Initially, Cullen was arrested on 1 count of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, and he admitted to both counts. Then in April 2004, Cullen pleaded guilty to killing 13 patients by lethal injection, and later on he went on to plead guilty to several of his other crimes. When the entire situation came to light, Cullen was given a life sentence in prison without parole for 30 years, and currently he is at the New Jersey State Prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life, facing 18 life sentences.
I tried myself throughout my life because I never really liked being who I was, because I didn't think I was worthy of anything.
When asked why he did what he did, Cullen claimed that he only killed patients who were going to die anyway. In fact, he did it to spare them from going into eventual cardiac or respiratory arrest. The twisted former nurse said that he killed his patients with overdoses to end their suffering. However, in doing so, he clearly failed to realize the ways in which he made them suffer. Cullen went on to say that his murders were often committed on impulse, and he never thought much about them, most of the time even spacing out entirely during his crimes, which just goes to show how dangerous it was for him to be around patients, and to think that just a little vigilance on one hospital's part could have prevented all of this.
I will leave you with this. I hope for you to live a long and miserable life behind bars.
You took God's most precious gift, babies, defenseless, innocent.
Known as the Angel of Death, Genene Jones was a heartless woman in every sense of the word. To the world, Genene was a dedicated pediatric nurse who worked day in and day out trying to make sure that the infants under her care pulled through in life or death situations. But little did they know that it was no one but the nurse herself who was putting these babies in the face of death. With years of experience under her belt, Genene worked at several hospitals and clinics in San Antonio, Texas, where she received some kind of sick thrill by injecting newborn babies with overdoses of lethal drugs. After being investigated and even dismissed from 2 of her jobs, Genene had no fear and continued her streak of crimes, targeting the most vulnerable children who were placed under her care. The authorities believe that Jones might have killed as many as 60 children. But how did she manage to get away with it all? Genene's career as a nurse started in 1981, when she started working as a licensed vocational nurse at the pediatric ICU in the Bexar County Hospital. During this time she spent there, Genene killed dozens during her 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, which her colleagues started referring to as the death shift. And while Genene was somehow always around when these children died, no one ever questioned her because the children would always die under mysterious circumstances that Genene orchestrated to look as natural as possible. Sometimes these kids would stop breathing while being completely fine previously. Sometimes they would have seizures, their hearts would stop, or they would start bleeding internally with their blood refusing to clot. Till 1982, Jean worked at Bexar County and was responsible for the death of 20 innocent babies. One of the children she murdered at Bexar County was Joshua Sawyer, who arrived at the ICU and was treated by Jones. The poor boy was suffering from a coma and constantly seizing due to smoke inhalation after a fire had destroyed his family's home. Genene took this opportunity to double his dose of Dilantin, an anti-seizure drug that led to Sawyer's death. What's sad is that the poor boy was showing noticeable signs of improvement, and his seizures had also stopped, leading the doctors to believe that he would eventually recover from his coma. But sadly, it all came crashing down because he was placed under the care of the angel of death.
Nobody knows this pain I carry, only I. And finally it's over.
Her baby, Rosemary Vega, was one of Jones' victims. Melissa Luna's brother, too, was killed by Jones.
Even though my brother's in a box, she's going to spend the rest of her life in a box, too. So I can smile.
The same month, Genene also killed 2-year-old Rosemary Vega by administering her with lethal drugs that put the poor girl under cardiac arrest. Eventually, the doctors at the hospital did come to the conclusion that the nurse was involved in these deaths somehow. And because the hospital had already received plenty of bad press for all of these incidents, Bexar County refused to fire Jones because that would create an even bigger public scandal for them. Eventually, the hospital completely rebranded and let go of all of its vocational nurses, including Jones. And when she left, the strange deaths also stopped. But somehow, no one caught on, or if they did, they chose to remain quiet about it. At the same time, Genene was offered a position at another department in the hospital, just like all the other nurses, only so that she wouldn't be singled out and deemed suspicious. All of this was done so that the hospital could avoid a big controversy and turn this entire situation into a facade of upgrading their quality of healthcare. And while Jones decided to leave the hospital and find something else, her reputation was as clean as ever, even though the hospital did launch an investigation and discovered that at least 10 children had mysteriously died under Jones's care. Because of her stellar references, Genene easily found another job at a pediatric center in Kerrville. But once again, as soon as she started working there, the children started mysteriously passing away, falling like dominoes. What was happening was that Genene was injecting these kids with lethal overdose injections. So even if a child came in for a regular checkup, under the nurse's care, they would suddenly develop a host of complications that would end up killing them. And if mysteriously the children made it through, Genene made herself look like the hero who saved the day. So it's safe to say that this woman was one smart criminal. The first time that the nurse was linked to a crime was when Chelsea McLennan, a 15-month-old baby, ended up passing away because her heart suddenly gave up. What's weird is that the baby had only come in for a round of immunization shots, but Genene had injected her not just once, but 3 times with a muscle relaxant that was too much for the child's small body. And because there were already doctors back at her old workplace ready to testify against her suspicious behavior, Jones was involved in a criminal investigation where she was convicted of not just this murder, but she was also held responsible for all of her previous crimes as well. She was then sentenced to 99 years in prison for McLennan's brutal murder. She was then charged with the death of 4-week-old Rolando Santos, who was injected with a lethal dose of blood thinners that reduced his body's ability to create clots. And while the boy could have easily death, he was miraculously saved in time. Back then, Jones claimed that it was her who had saved the baby, but eventually the investigation led to the discovery that it was none other than the nurse herself who was responsible for the crime in the first place. This gave Jones another 60 years on her sentence. After serving time, Jones was set to be let out in 2018 for good behavior during her sentence. But the authorities have tried their best to find more evidence to make sure that this killer nurse is locked away for good. The tricky part is that Jones has destroyed the records at Bexar County Hospital, so there's practically no evidence linking her to her death shift and all of the children that passed away during this time. But the authorities suspect that from the 1970s to the 1980s, Jones killed over 60 children, earning her the name Baby Killer in the eyes of the public. To this day, Jones has never given an explanation for her crimes, but something tells us that she did all of this to play the role of the hero to make herself feel important. Sad that she had to take so many innocent lives just to feel that rush. The world has seen plenty of corrupt medical practitioners, but Efren Saldivar tops the list of them all. Working as a respiratory therapist, Saldivar has actually lost count of the patients that he has murdered, which goes on to show just how brutal his reign of terror really was. Efren started working as a respiratory therapist after he graduated from the College of Medical and Dental Careers in North Hollywood. His first job was at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center, where he would often be put on the night shift when there were relatively fewer people around. Taking advantage of the situation, Saldivar would get a kick out of injecting his patients with high doses of paralytic drugs that would lead to respiratory or cardiac arrest. And because he would do this while no one else was around, no one could really trace the deaths back to him.
My mom would get frightened about her breathing, and she felt more secure being at the hospital when she couldn't breathe.
At 2:05 a.m., Jean's blood pressure dropped to 0. Minutes later, she went into respiratory arrest.
All right, I need some ventilations here. Stop breathing.
Jean bounced back quickly. Within 40 minutes, she was stable and well-oriented.
I got a call from the hospital late at night. I was shocked as I had just talked to her and she was fine before that. I asked the nurse what had happened. Did she have a stroke or a heart attack or something? What caused that? And she said that they didn't know the cause. It just happened. Mom told me that she had felt funny that evening and she couldn't breathe. So she pushed the button for the nurse, and she remembers waking up to being resuscitated by Mr. Efren Saldivar, who was the respiratory therapist.
The truth is that the murderer was really smart in his approach. He would often use a drug called pancuronium to kill his patients, a drug that is used to stop people's breathing right before they are about to be put on ventilators. So when Saldivar gave the patients this drug without giving them a means of artificial breathing, they would obviously pass away. Saldivar would exclusively choose victims who were unconscious and in the face of certain death so that the doctors wouldn't be suspicious. So while there was a sudden rise in the number of deaths at the hospital during his graveyard shifts, no one ever suspected a harmless-looking respiratory therapist to be the cause behind it all.
Baker told Saldivar to stay away from his patients.
Understood?
Baker decided he had to do something.
I said, in short, people are saying that Efren's killing his patients. They told me that he killed this one particular patient in CCU, and I could get you the name if you need it.
Saldivar was also smart with the frequency and timings of his murder, making sure not to replicate any patterns so that no one would have any reason to investigate him. And that's how he kept getting away with his sick crimes, one after the other. When his crimes caught up with him, Saldivar claimed that he would only kill patients who were close to death. He would often resort to drugs that would stop their breathing or send them into cardiac arrest because that's what he found the easiest and least suspicious way to take lives. When asked if he ever felt guilty about his crimes, Saldivar responded that he would just get angry seeing his patients alive. "We had too much work," said the former medical practitioner. So he took it upon himself to go through the list of patients at the hospital, eliminating them one by one to reduce his own workload. So it's safe to assume that his murders came from a place of selfishness. Saldivar refers to himself as the angel of death and claims that he would kill patients who seemed ready to die themselves. The criminal has also talked about his own ethical criteria for picking victims, which is how he chooses to justify his behavior. What is this ethical criteria? It's the fact that he would only kill patients who had signed a do not resuscitate order. Pretty creepy, right? So how did his literal graveyard shift come to an end? According to the criminal himself, he started killing patients sometime in 1986 and stopped when one of his colleagues spotted morphine in his locker. That's when the hospital started keeping a close eye on Saldivar's actions and rumors about him, and his magical syringe started flying around, with people believing that he was responsible for all the strange deaths that were taking place at the hospital. Ultimately, the police received an anonymous call from someone who claimed that Saldivar was helping patients die faster. This led to a 2-month investigation that didn't really reveal anything, since the criminal covered his tracks pretty well.
He said that he had been doing this. He killed his first patient approximately 6 months after he became a respiratory therapist, and he became a respiratory therapist in 1989. And remember, this interview that we were conducting with Saldivar was taking place in March of 1998, so we're looking at 9 years of work that he had been doing at local hospitals.
Did we have a person that was psychologically unstable, or did we truly have a murderer? And that's what made it difficult, even after his confession. Because the confession, a lot of things he was saying, a lot didn't make sense, and a lot did make sense.
At this point, all we had was a confession. We had no physical evidence. We had no identified victims.
On March 3rd, Saldivar issued a confession, claiming he had killed over 50 patients at the very least. When his confession made its way to the public, Saldivar was obviously fired from his job. When he talked to the press, the former medical practitioner told them that he was extremely depressive and wanted to commit suicide. But because he didn't have the courage to take his own life, he settled for taking other people's. How twisted is that? This led to an entire investigation where the police exhumed the bodies of the 171 patients who had died while Saldivar was working at the hospital, and 20 of them were found to have an excess amount of lethal drugs in their systems, giving authorities all the evidence they needed to charge Saldivar with multiple counts of murder. Eventually, Saldivar ended up redacting his confession, but by then all the evidence pointed toward him. In January 2001, the twisted criminal was arrested and charged with 6 confirmed counts of murder, with the police suspecting his involvement in plenty more. Eventually, to avoid the death penalty, Efren Saldivar pleaded guilty to all counts, and currently he is held at the California Substance Abuse Treatment Faculty, where he is seeking treatment for his violent tendencies that have led to the death of multiple innocent people who could have survived if it wasn't for him.